Right. So welcome everyone to today's Virtual Digital Economy seminar. Reinhold Kessler and Zurich will moderate today's talk and introduce our guest in just a moment. Briefly, before we start, please send any clarifying questions to everyone in the chat window throughout the talk. Reinhold will manage the queue and interrupt the speaker at a convenient time for you to ask a question or ask the question for you. We'll collect all remaining questions for the Q&A after the talk, so don't hesitate at any time to post questions in the chat. Today's session will be recorded, so if you do ask a question, you will appear in the recording. Feel free to turn on your camera to give the speaker and all of us a more interactive experience, but don't be obliged. All right, I'm happy to leave the screen to Reinhold.
Thanks, Hannes. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. Very excited to have Emilia Fletcher here with us today. Emilia is a professor of competition policy at the University of East Anglia and deputy director at the Center for Competition Policy. One thing that really stands out about Emilia's research is that she is always one step ahead in identifying crucial policy issues, for example, about the regulation of digital platforms. And I guess the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK agrees, since she is a non-executive director there too. And in that vein, Emilia today brings us another highly relevant topic about biased recommender systems. And I'm very much looking forward to the paper. And so Emilia, thanks again for coming, and the screen is yours.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to present this paper as well, which is on exactly what it says on the tin, i.e. biased recommender systems and supplier competition, and I'll try and explain what that all means. So I'll launch straight in if I can. Hang on. There we are. So what are recommender systems? I think probably many of you will know. Well, you'll all know what they are. You may not have applied that term to them, but basically they are the algorithms that order things for you on the internet. So on Amazon, for example, it's the algorithms that decide which things, suggested recommendations should be ranked in. Likewise on booking.com, but even on things like Spotify, the recommender systems are the algorithms which decide which songs should go into playlists, which songs should be recommended to you as kind of possible suggestions below playlists, etc. And even things like your Facebook timeline or your Twitter timeline, the way in which it is ordered is basically done by a recommender system algorithm. So they're all over the place, all over the internet, and they take many different forms. And that's what this paper is going to be focusing on. So, but in particular, what we're going to be focusing on is the impact on the suppliers who basically supply their product through the recommender system. So this is a really simple diagram, but you have your suppliers, your recommender system, and then your recommender system will recommend some of those suppliers, or at least they will recommend them in an ordered way. And because people don't typically look at go very far down a list, the effect is that they just recommend a subset of those suppliers. And obviously what that means is each individual consumer isn't seeing all of the suppliers that are available at the top, they're just seeing a subset of those suppliers. And it seems natural, actually, that would have some effect on competition. And this is part of a process of trying to think about what that effect would be. So the motivation of the paper is to think about, actually, if those recommender systems are biased in some way, and I'll come on and tell you about biases in a second, how would that affect supplier competition upstream? And in particular, in this paper, what we're trying to think about is what's the implication on then the pricing incentives of those suppliers upstream, and in an extension, which I'll hopefully get onto, also what are their incentives to invest in vertical quality. I should emphasize that it's part of a wider work program with my co-authors that were on the first page, where we are trying to, it's all about this question about recommender system biases and their implications for supplier competition, but we're looking at it in a variety of different ways. So there's one paper already online which looks kind of first principles at the types of bias that you see and the types of implications for competition we might expect to see. But it's a bit hand wavy. So I think it's a useful paper, but it's very, very high level and kind of first principles stuff. And having done that paper, we thought, well, can we be more rigorous about this? So this is part of the being more rigorous. And just to highlight that the team involved includes economists and computer scientists. So the computer scientists really understand the algorithms. I don't. And they understand the consumer science literature as well. And then Peter Ormosi and I are the economists on the team. And in particular, I'm the economic theorist on the team. So the theory is all mine in the team, but the team together has kind of has formulated the problem and identified the biases that drive it. So, basically, the computer science literature identifies a few types of canonical recommender systems, so kind of standard types of recommender system. In fact, what we see in reality is we'll see recommender systems that are hybrid. They'll take bits of all of these aspects, but it's useful to just identify the kind of most basic building blocks of recommender systems. The first is popularity-based filtering. So what that does is basically pretty simple. It says you've searched for, let's say, a green thermos. I'm going to come back to a green thermos flask later. So you search for a green thermos flask. This is the most popular item that meets your search term. Popularity-based filtering, very straightforward. Then there's social filtering, which basically says we've identified what social network you're in, for example, through Facebook or whatever. People in your social network, this is the most popular item amongst those people, or they tend to like this. Then there's content-based filtering, which basically looks at the attributes of particular products and compares the attributes of particular products. So what that tends to say is, if you liked that item, then you might like this similar item. So if you think about Spotify, that when they're doing their recommender systems, they might well be doing that. They'll say, well, you've listened to this 60s girl group. Here's another 60s girl group that's not dissimilar. You might like that too. And then there's collaborative filtering, which basically looks at the interactions between consumers and items and basically says, are there other consumers who like similar items to the items that you've liked in the past? And if so, what other items do those consumers like? Then we'll recommend those consumers, those items to you, because you're obviously a similar type of consumer, because in the past you've liked similar types of items. And just to highlight that that collaborative filtering is a very specific recommender system that Calvano and Emilio Calvano, Giacomo Calzolari, and a few others are doing. They're doing some simulation work looking at specifically the collaborative filtering recommender system. It's really interesting work. It's forthcoming. They have spoken about it publicly, but the paper I think is still forthcoming. But I think they don't maybe make as clear as they might, or at least they didn't in their previous version of their paper I saw, that that's just one type of recommender system. There's lots of different types of recommender system, although it's a very common type of recommender system. And recommender systems also a little bit more on how they work, and this is important for the bias side of things. What they essentially do is they take a lot of data, so they draw on as much data as possible, but that's kind of inherently incomplete data, and it will be either data on the product characteristics or data on the user product interactions or data on the users themselves, which social networks they're in. And then it uses that data and applies a statistical model of this, one of the sorts that I just described. And then that model generates a probabilistic distribution of possible things to recommend, and they'll then be ranked on the basis of that probabilistic distribution, and then that will be fed through an online choice architecture. Now, the online choice architecture could take many different forms. It could simply show you one product. It could show you a ranked set of products. It could show you a small number of products, a large number of products. They could be presented in different colors or different shapes. So you could see that the way in which the model feeds into the online choice architecture will affect the way in which consumers react. We know that consumers, choices online are very strongly influenced by the way in which those choices are presented in the choice architecture. That then feeds into, therefore, the user interaction. But of course, the user interaction creates more data. And then the data gets fed into the model, and then the model feeds. So you have this continuous feedback loop. And what that means is that if there's biases at any stage of this model, they can become exacerbated through the model. And indeed, if there's biases for a certain amount of time, even if in, for example, the data, even if you then you try to remove the biases in the data, they will have fed through, and they may become very difficult to remove as you move on. And what sorts of biases is it that are of interest here? Much of the literature in this kind of space so far looks at the risks of self-preferencing, or the preferencing of suppliers that offer a platform higher margins, or the preferencing of suppliers who don't sell cheaper elsewhere. So those are all obvious they have an obvious economic driver. They're very good papers, they're perfectly sensible things to look at. But our focus in this work was actually to think about the systemic biases inherent in recommender systems. So just that are inherent in those sorts of statistical model approaches that I just talked about. And those can include, an obvious one is incumbency bias, or in computer science terminology, they call it the cold start problem. And this is the bias towards recommending existing items over new items. And if you think about what I've said about recommender systems, it's almost obvious that this would be a problem, because you have lots and lots of data about products that already exist, and you don't have any data initially about new products. So when you're running your algorithm, it's going to naturally get better estimates, and the existing products are more likely to get recommended, because the errors around the expectations are going to be lower, and they're more likely to hit the top of the recommendation distribution. On Spotify, for example, I believe that's one of the reasons why they have editorial playlists for new songs that are created by actual humans. And then because humans can help overcome this incumbency bias, they can listen to new songs and decide, is this actually a good song? If so, I'm going to give it a boost. And that then creates data that then starts to train the algorithms, and then the algorithms can take over. Popularity bias is another one, which is again obvious in that the most popular items will also have the largest amount of data about them. So you'll have more data about user interactions with the most popular items than with less popular items. And therefore, again, these recommender systems, what I've said so far, just to highlight these different filtering systems all exhibit these various biases to different degrees, but they all basically do these various biases. There's homogeneity bias, which is a bias towards recommending similar items to a given individual over more diverse items. If you think about it in the context of Spotify, it's kind of saying, well, this person has listened to Adele before. They obviously like Adele, so I'm going to basically play them more Adele, which is, you can very easily see how a recommender system could think that was a good idea or wouldn't have a better idea anyway. But that may not be the most, that may not actually be the best recommendation. It's just what the data is available for. And you can get something called conformity bias, which is sometimes known as the echo chamber problem in kind of content space, which is the bias towards recommending similar items to a given group of people. So their specific group of people are always all getting the same recommendations, and then another specific group of people might all get a different recommendation. So in this paper, what I'm going to focus on is popularity bias and conformity bias. To be fair, in our high overarching principles paper, we talk about the impact of all of these biases. And incumbency bias, you can immediately see the most obvious impact is going to be that it's going to be limiting entry. It's going to act as a barrier to entry. So we don't look at that. I don't look at this. We don't look at that at all in this paper. Partly because, as you will see, we don't have entry and exit in this paper. We're looking at a static market structure and thinking about the implications of popularity bias and conformity bias. And just to highlight upfront, in case I don't get onto all of these results, but I really hope that I will, the key findings. So the first is that these recommender system biases can act to dampen competition between the upstream suppliers. And effectively, the reason for that is that the link, if you think about it from the supplier's perspective, the link between offering a better deal and gaining more sales is weakened if actually offering a better deal and gaining more sales doesn't play through in a straightforward way through the recommender system, if actually there are biases at play. And so in which case competition is dampened. The effect of that in this model is that prices are actually increased because of the dampened competition. When it's endogenized, average quality can actually increase or decrease because it's a bit complex, but prices definitely increase. What we also look at is there can be competition to be recommended by the recommender system. So in that sense, you can get it's a kind of competition for the market. So the existence of a recommender system in itself dampens competition kind of in the market, but competition to get the benefit of that bias might go against that. And it mitigates the harm to competition, but that consumers overall are still left worse off with the bias than if there was less bias. And also that sort of competition for the market may not actually help if we have endogenous quality. In fact, what you get there is that the firms compete on quality, not on price, but because quality is a strategic substitute rather than a strategic complement, if one firm decides to compete really hard on quality, the other one will back off, and overall quality doesn't go up very much. And so you get the competition for the market doesn't have the positive benefits that competition for the market has on price. Another point to make, though, is it is somewhat complex, even in what is a really simple model. And so precise rankings vary depending on whether we have rational consumers versus what I term behavioral consumers, whether vertical quality is endogenous, those are my extension, and also on the extent of the bias. A final key finding, and this is a finding kind of standard across lots of these sorts of models, but I think it's still worth highlighting, is that in choosing its recommender system, so we assume a platform gets to choose its recommender system, its interests are not typically going to be aligned with those of consumers. So I'm going to leap over the related economic literature. I've basically mentioned it already. Those are just the names of the papers. Just to highlight at the bottom that the other work that we're doing is more like the Calvano et al. Work in that it relates to recommender system simulations. And there we are looking at the impact of the different sorts of biases on entry and exit decisions. In fact, that's primarily about entry and exit and concentration. So it's about a very different aspect to what I'm looking at here.
Amelia, before you
Yes.
maybe jump into the model, there are
Yes.
some questions, and some of them are maybe also clarifying nature.
Okay.
So maybe you can help us elaborating on the definition of a recommender system. So should we be thinking about these systems relative to alternative systems? This is what Daniel Asmat is asking.
So what's the counterfactual to recommend? Oh, sorry. So I should highlight that recommender systems are mostly very good in that. That should have been my number one point, which is that obviously online, there is a huge selection of different products available. And frankly, without recommender systems, we would really struggle to deal with the panoply of different things available, all of the music available on Spotify, all of the products available on Amazon. So recommender systems are a good thing. So I'm never saying, my counterfactual is never no recommender system. My counterfactual is always either a recommender system without bias or a different type of a recommender system with a different type of bias. Does that answer the question?
I think Daniel could also.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I guess perhaps as we get into the model, it will be more clear exactly what we mean by recommendation system bias.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we'll wait till the end and you can see what you think.
I think Luis Cabral had just a follow-up question, and then we can move on and maybe the other questions for later.
Yeah, Luis.
Yeah, I get your point about the plethora of offerings online, but why is filtering not an alternative to recommender system? I mean, if I go to an online wine store, for example, there are thousands of wines, and recommender systems are not that helpful at all. And I have to work with a filtering system, and it seems to work relatively well.
That's actually a really good point. So yes, filtering system is a better, it can be a solution. And then yes, you don't need to have a recommender system, but in practice, filtering usually, there's such a large number of products that filtering usually only gets you so far. You run out of things that you want to filter on. And so there's usually, even at the end of all the filtering that you can think of to do, there's still a decision about how to rank the remaining options. And that's where the recommender system comes in. It could be a random recommender system, to be honest. That would still be a recommender system, although not a very interesting one. But yeah, so hopefully that answers that a little bit. Okay, I'm going to get on, but yeah, we can discuss more of this later. So it's basically my model, or our model, a really simple Hotelling model. So you have consumers. Let's assume that I've typed in to a online marketplace a green thermos. That's what I want, and it's we assume a monopoly platform, and the monopoly platform recommends two relevant products, A and B. Never mind the panoply. I'm just going to say, for simplicity, there's only two products that it identifies as possible. Also, though, consumers don't know their own preferences across these products. That maybe goes to your filtering point. They don't actually know enough about these products, or indeed possibly enough about themselves, to work out which of these products is actually best for them. They do in practice sit along a Hotelling line, but they don't know where they sit on that Hotelling line. And we assume that the platform or recommender system charges the suppliers, if they make a sale, it charges them 1 minus F of the revenue that they make. That obviously leaves the suppliers with F times the revenue that they make. And I should just highlight, as I don't think I maybe on the next slide, I thought I had it somewhere, but because we're setting it up this way, this model is suitable for thinking about intermediation platforms like e-commerce sites where a sale is made, where a transaction is made. It's not suitable for thinking about subscription sites like Spotify, where the consumers pay a single payment, and then there's a completely separate series of payments between the platform and the creators that put their music on Spotify. So this is where there's a kind of one-for-one transaction process. So slightly more formally, so we've got two suppliers at either side of the unit interval, 0 and 1. It's a large number of consumers normalized to 1 with product preference parameter. And this is all standard Hotelling stuff, X, where X is along 0 and 1 as uniform, it's uniform distribution. So really, really simple. They incur transport costs TX if they buy from A, or T1 minus X otherwise. They have a willingness to pay. All we've assumed with willingness to pay is that it's a high enough relative to transport costs that the market is fully covered, and that all consumers make positive actual utility at equilibrium. So, introducing the recommender system biases, what we've assumed is that consumers are new to the product, but not to the platform. So they've been on this platform before lots of times, but they've never actually searched before for green thermos. So they don't know anything about the suppliers of green thermoses, but they do know, but they have past experience with the platform. What that means is the platform has relevant information about those consumers' preferences in relation to this product, because they know about their interests in other products. That's what they use to do their recommender system. But that information is incomplete. And the platform utilizes a recommender system to help provide recommendations that are in line with consumer preferences. One thing I forgot to say, very important thing I forgot to say, because there's only 2 products in this model, actually the recommender system only recommends 1 product. Now, obviously, in the real world, there'd be lots of options, and they might recommend, 2 or 3, although they'd be ranked. But here, because it's very simple, it's just 2 products, and they recommend just 1. Okay. When they make that recommendation, there's a probability 1 minus beta that the recommender system predicts preferences really well and makes a perfect recommendation. But there's a probability of beta that the recommendation is biased because the statistical model is biased in one of the ways that I've described above. Those biased recommendations may in fact be suitable, because I might recommend something because it's popular and it actually might actually be the best thing for you anyway. But that's by coincidence, it's not by design. And neither the platform nor the suppliers nor the consumers ever know whether any specific recommendation is biased. They know beta, they know how the model works generally, but they can't tell in the specific case of any recommendation whether it's biased. And the effect of beta is to reduce the relevance of the supplier's actual offering for whether or not it's recommended in a given period. And there are 3 types of bias that we consider that the recommender system can exhibit, which is actually there's 2 types of bias, but we look at 2 variants of one of them. The first is conformity bias. And we assume that with likelihood beta, the recommender system recommends the product that is most popular amongst consumers in their neighborhood. And how we've modeled that is we've said their neighborhood is their end of the line. And we've assumed that the recommender system it doesn't know exactly where they are on the line, but it does know which end of the line they are. So which neighborhood they're in. So we thought hard about how to model conformity bias on a telling line. And this is what we came up with. It would be interesting to get comments. And then popularity bias is more straightforward. So with likelihood beta, the recommender system simply recommends the product that was most popular either at the start of the game, and that's called stable popularity bias. And that way, there's no way of competing for that. If whoever gets the benefit of that bias just has it forever. Or it's whichever was the most popular in the previous period. And what that we call that reactive popularity bias. And what that does, it allows suppliers to compete to be the most popular. If they can get 50% plus epsilon in the previous period, then they get to be the most popular in the next period and get the benefit of popularity bias. In the basic model, we assume that consumers are behavioral in the sense that they adopt a strategy of simply accepting the recommendations made, and that reflects extensive evidence on ranking and saliency bias out there in the behavioral literature. We also, however, check that consumers make positive utility, and we suggest that given that they make positive utility, they would have no real reason to change this strategy. It's a kind of rational behavioral strategy, as it were. We then consider, however, a situation where consumers are rational, in the sense that they can reject recommendations as being unsuitable if they wish. And here, actually, we assume that consumers know quite a lot in that they understand everything about the game. They understand both. They know both prices. They know the type and extent of the bias. The only thing they don't know, because we have to assume this, is that they don't know their own location on the Hotelling line. So they don't know which of the products is actually best for them, given the prices. And finally, we've now done it for behavioral and rational consumers. We look at endogenous vertical quality. So if we just look at the exogenous quality and behavioral consumers first, what this figure shows us basically the effect of conformity bias. Effectively what happens is, and it's natural from how I've described it already, increasing bias reduces for it's a symmetrical model because both suppliers have a symmetrical benefit in basically automatically being recommended for beta of the consumers at their end of the Hotelling line. Beta increases the extent to which they automatically get those consumers and therefore weakens the competition between them. It pushes out the reaction functions, and prices will increase. With stable popularity bias, I should have just highlighted the original lines, RI, that's a situation with an ideal recommender system which knows everything and makes perfect recommendations, so a completely unbiased recommender system. And we look at the increase in bias relative to the introduction and increase in bias relative to that. With stable popularity bias, supplier B, so we assume that supplier A gets the benefit of the popularity bias, just by assumption. At the start of the game, it was the person most popular historically. Supplier B therefore doesn't get any benefit its reaction function is completely unchanged by the popularity bias. But supplier A's reaction function shifts out, and it shifts out more because it gets consumers right along the Hotelling line, beta consumers right along the Hotelling line. So its reaction function shifts up twice as much as in the previous reaction function shifts. Of course, as you might expect, because these are strategic complements, prices go up for both A and B. But prices for A go up more than prices for B. With reactive popularity bias, what we get is exactly the same for A. The way we've modeled reactive popularity bias is we've assumed that the most popular firm in any period is A, but the identity of that firm changes in every period because so B is always the disruptor and A is always the one with the popularity benefit of popularity bias. So therefore A might be a different firm to in the previous picture, but in the previous figure, but the effect of the popularity bias in that period is exactly the same on its reaction functions. But B, which is now the firm that could be disruptive, actually what it wants to do is its only aim is to price in such a way that it wins 50% of the market plus epsilon. And that generates a change, a 45-degree actually reaction function. Interestingly, so it drives up prices. Interestingly, the prices of B in that situation are exactly as they would be with zero bias at all. The equilibrium of price of B is exactly the same as if there was no bias. But of course, A is still getting the benefit of the popularity bias. So the average prices will have increased. And so this shows how equilibrium prices in these three models increases with the extent of bias. And what you see is that average prices are highest with stable popularity bias. So where you know who is most popular right up front. They're a little lower with the conformity bias, where it's a similar effect, but it's split between the two firms. And then much lower with reactive popularity bias, where you have this competition for the market. So competition to get the benefits of the popularity bias. So prices there are still not as low as they would be with zero bias, but they are a lot lower. And then finally, in terms of, for this version of the model, in terms of the disaligned incentives, what this figure shows is very simply platform revenues. So platform revenues, platform simply in our model assumes F, 1 minus F of the revenues made by the suppliers. And so it's exogenous F. We can't figure out a way to endogenize it within the simple model that we have, but actually the rationale would be that this is one search amongst many, many, many searches, and you wouldn't want to end up changing your fee. It would be almost impossible for a platform to change its fee on a kind of per search basis. So from the point of view of any individual search, it probably makes sense for the fee to be exogenous. But we recognize it's big. It's a major simplification in terms of modeling. However, in the context of that being exogenous, what you find is that the revenues and platform and consumers have absolutely opposed interests in terms of the choice of recommender system by the platform. And in a way, that's not so surprising, but it's very clear and stark. Just to highlight, this shows what consumer surplus looks like for the behavioral consumers. So for the 1 minus beta consumers who are getting unbiased recommendations, then for the prices that are given the equilibrium prices, they are actually purchasing suitably because they're getting unbiased recommendations. But for the beta consumers who are receiving biased recommendations, some of them, the ones that are close to A, the most popular product, are actually choosing suitably anyway. But those that are at the other end, who are closer to B, are choosing unsuitably, and clearly their consumer surplus is harmed by that, is a lot lower. And they are the consumers who are therefore most likely to reject a recommendation once we introduce rationality, which we do now. So if consumers can observe prices of both products and know the type and extent of bias, what they can do is they they get their recommendation, and they can then infer information about their own location from the recommendation that they're given. Essentially, they're more likely to get a recommendation of A if they're closer to A, but they don't know that it's still the right recommendation. And obviously, they know that it's more likely to be accurate the lower is the level of bias. So the higher is the lower level of bias, the greater the risk that someone pretty close to B is actually being recommended A. And therefore, the more likely a consumer is to say, yeah, that doesn't sound good, I'm going to reject this. What we actually find is that, so under conformity bias, just to check that one off, actually rational consumers at equilibrium behavioral consumers at equilibrium get recommended the most suitable product for them anyway in our symmetrical model. So actually rational consumers would act no differently, and therefore nothing changes. Under popularity bias, however, as I've just shown you, that's really not true. For low level of bias, it is true because actually people it's roughly likely to be true, and therefore it's not worth rejecting. But as the extent of bias and therefore misallocation increases, there will be a critical level of bias beyond which rational consumers who are recommended product A would reject it at the kind of behavioral prices that we've just seen in the model. And for reactive popularity bias, this actually occurs when beta gets to 0.25. For stable popularity bias, it occurs for a slightly higher beta, 0.303. And beyond these critical betas, the risk of rejection then constrains the price that is charged by supplier A, the supplier that wants to benefit from the popularity bias. So it has an incentive to cut its price so that consumers still accept the recommendation. Interestingly, beyond this point, there is no longer a reactive variant of popularity bias. And that's, I won't get into why it is. I can go into it later if people would like to know. So what that then looks like in terms of disaligned incentives is with stable popularity bias, the revenues after your critical level actually start to fall with increased bias, because you're having the supplier A keeps having to curb its prices in order to persuade increasingly skeptical consumers that they should accept the recommendation. Meanwhile, the RP, the reactive popularity bias curve just stops at 0.25. And we see the picture for consumer surplus as well. And what we find there is there's still more or less disaligned incentives, but there is this tiny area where, in fact, the platform and the consumers have aligned incentives. I don't actually know how interesting that is, but it does show they're not fully disaligned. I think that I'm going to have to, I'll tell you how we have endogenized quality, but I haven't got time to go through the results, but the paper is now online. It'd be really interesting to get comments before we submit it anywhere. What we do is we assume that each supplier can choose vertical quality at the start of each period. I've just realized one thing I didn't say, which is very important. It's an infinitely repeated game. That's quite a key thing I didn't say at the start. It's an infinitely repeated game, but there is no learning through time. But the reason it has to be infinitely repeated is to get this reactive popularity bias thing working. So what you actually get is a bit like the overlapping generations situation, where in any one period, one is the more popular and one is the less popular, and then they swap round. And you don't want to have an end to that repetition. So that's the only reason it's an infinitely repeated game. But we only really analyze 2 periods. In fact, we only really analyze 1 period. Anyway, so at the start of each of those periods, suppliers choose the vertical quality, and they have a fixed cost of that quality, which is quadratic in the quality. And consumers now have their willingness to pay, the exogenous willingness to pay is V plus the quality. And we also make this assumption of something called K, which is just identical to a set of the parameters. It's just mathematically easier, but it's increasing in all of the costs of the model, the costs of quality, the platform fee, and the transport costs. And I won't go through these unless people want to, but we look at quality, we look at price. We show that, again, with behavioral consumers, we have no alignment of incentives. When we look at this is beta and K space. So that up the side, left-hand side is all the possible biases, and on the right-hand side is all the possible, well, not all the possible, but because it could go up to infinity, but a set of possible K cost parameters, and there is no alignment of the platform incentives and the consumers' incentives. We then bring in rational consumers again, and we see that it does strange things beyond the critical betas to competition. You get the competition on quality, not the competition on price. That does drive up costs and therefore changes price. And then we do get this rather strange situation where we do similar to the I've got a cat behind me, similar to the picture I showed you before with national consumers get a couple of patches, but there are some I will just talk about the caveats. I know I'm meant to be stopping, but we assume a monopoly platform. Obviously, platform incentives may become better aligned with those of consumers if they have to compete for those consumers. We assume unit market outputs. Platform incentives may become better aligned with those of consumers if they have the potential to expand sales or expand the size of the market. We assume no learning by either the platform or the consumers over time. And certainly that could again weaken the impact or the extent of the biases. We assume that the platform, I've said about the exogenous share of revenues, so different payment arrangements could change its incentives. We assume no potential for entry or indeed exit. And one thing that I probably didn't make clear enough, is that in practice, the different recommender systems there are exhibit a collection of different biases. For simplicity and to try and bring out what the actual biases were doing, we've looked at a situation, kind of in a way, an unrealistic situation where you have a choice between recommender systems, each of which has one sole bias. So there's a one-for-one relationship between a recommender system and a type of bias. Whereas a typical recommender system will have a mix of biases to a different extent. So the optimal choice of recommender system in that situation is more complex. Clearly, the very simplified nature of this model limits the policy conclusions that can properly be drawn. And I didn't really think it was right to even go there. But I think what it does do is it shows the potential for recommender systems to impact the competition between suppliers. And obviously we're doing more on that in other frames. But I think what that does mean is it is an issue that competition authorities do need to be aware of and thinking about, even in the absence of self-preferencing. But in the end, actually, I end up with a call. I think it's really interesting. I hope you think it's interesting too. But I think there's a need for much more work in this area, whether it's empirical, simulation-based, or theory. And I will end there. And I'm sorry, I'm 5 minutes over.
So thank you very much, Amelia. This was great. We do have a couple of questions, and I would say we'll start with Luis Cabral, who had a series of great comments in the chat that I also copy for you. So maybe Luis, you can start.
Yeah, in fact, my first couple of questions, they are the same question. And it seems to me that an interesting extension, perhaps already thought about that, is competition between platforms. Why is that important? Because if there's no competition, it seems to me that in some cases, the optimal policy for the platform is kill one of the sellers, let the other seller price that monopoly and take a cut off of it. And I'll be much happier than having any recommender system. In fact, that's the ultimate bias, if you will. But of course, the reason why that's not okay is twofold. First, there could be other platforms. Second, there's an outside option, and consumers may want to go elsewhere. And that's related to the technical question that I had, which is what role does full market coverage play in your model? Clearly, there's this first part that I just mentioned. If V is that very high, then forget about recommender systems. I'll just have the the monopoly recommender system. You buy from this one, and that's it. But also, even in the duopoly context, I'm just curious. I actually don't know the answer. If there's an economic meaning to the full market assumption in here.
I think that's a really interesting question. I said it here. In fact, I think if there isn't, when I said unit market output, what I meant was full market coverage, I realized. And basically, I think that you're right that if there is the potential for not full market coverage, then that would, again, incentivize the platform better. But in fact, I mean, we've assumed full market coverage by assuming a high enough willingness to pay. So in order to not get that, we'd have to lower the willingness to pay. It would be interesting to see what happens, but yeah, we haven't done it yet. Yeah. You're right.
Okay. Just a thought.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Next up would be Coleman Strumpf.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the paper. I had a literature question, but that's in the text. You can look at that and discard it. I actually want to follow up a little on one of Luis's earlier comments, which was about filtering. It had me thinking a little bit because, like, I'm more familiar with the music side of things, and once upon a time there was kind of these two approaches to recommendation. Last FM, which I think has kind of largely disappeared, was a filtering type system where they categorized music under all these different characteristics, and it still had a social element in terms of what was recommended. But I think the issue was Last FM hit the scaling issue. It was like incredibly expensive to categorize these products. And it just had me thinking in general about all these different recommendation systems, how complicated they are to implement, or how expensive they are to implement. And anyway, just kind of a general comment.
So I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, Last FM is still going actually, but and doing something. But I think that you're right, because actually one of the questions that is a natural question to come out of this is you've, Amelia, defined all of these, you've analysed these incredibly simplistic recommender systems, but aren't real recommender systems much more sophisticated? And it is true that they can be much more sophisticated, and there's a whole, there are tons and tons of computer scientists working on all of the different ways in which one could make more sophisticated recommender systems. But and I'm sure that there will be ever more sophisticated versions, but I'm fairly sure that you're right that the more sophisticated they are, the more costly they will come to be to run, and there may be a real cost decision in there. So obviously we haven't looked at that at all, but I think that's a really good point. There's another interesting thing which we also haven't analysed, if anyone fancies analysing it, which is that one of the ways in which you can improve a recommender system is by increasing the degree of experimentation, because when you apply your model and you get your distribution of possible distribution of likelihoods that it's a good recommendation, what a normal recommender system will do is kind of pick the most likely and put that top of the list. Because that's the likely to be the most relevant recommendation for someone. But if you always do that, you don't really learn more about the person. So what you can do is you can use your distribution curve and with the relevant likelihood, pick something else, some of the time or all of the time. And that has the effect that actually it is less likely to actually be a good recommendation, but you are more likely to learn more about the consumer's preferences. And therefore, there might be a trade-off between short-term quality of recommendation systems and long-term quality of recommendation systems. So I think that's a really interesting point as well. But again, this model, very simple model, doesn't look at that either.
All right, thank you. So one question asked by Markus Lill was, how do those biases interact with each other? Like long existing items also somewhat are maybe the most popular items as well. So even though he is not in the room anymore, maybe he watches the YouTube recording afterwards. So.
I mean, it really depends how, I guess, the popularity bias exhibits itself, which would depend on the precise way in which you created your recommender system. So even, even within a popularity recommender system, you can imagine it being defined lots of different ways, a bit like what we have with the stable versus the reactive. So you could say, okay, I'm going to recommend the thing that's historically most popular, or you could say I'm going to recommend the thing that was most popular in the previous period. And clearly the latter is going to link less with incumbency bias than the former. But I think you're right that yes, some of the same, there are clearly linkages between the incumbency bias and the popularity bias and the underlying driver of it, which is lack of data. But I think they do slightly different things. In our other paper, in fact, we analyze a bit more, and what you actually find is, so clearly popularity bias tends to drive up concentration because you're recommending the most popular thing, whereas incumbency bias tends to prevent entry but doesn't necessarily affect concentration.
Thank you very much. Last question, as we slowly run out of the official time, at least, is Christian Peukert with a question.
Emilia, this is really interesting work. So right in the beginning, you characterized one type of bias as a cold start problem. I was thinking whether you had some thoughts on how privacy policy interacts with the results that you have, because some platforms might not have enough data to give good recommendations, or the data might be gone because someone pulls out their personal data, and whether actually privacy policy can sort of with recommender systems interact with competition policy. I guess that's what I'm asking.
That is a really good question. I hadn't thought about it before, and I'm just thinking about it now, and it strikes me that some of the recommender systems it would have an impact on, and some it wouldn't. So, for example, the content-based filtering basically takes information about the nature of the products and recommends, it's the recommending Adele to someone that's had Adele in the past. So as long as someone's had Adele in the past, which if they're continuing as your consumer, that probably, I don't know whether that would be a breach. It depends exactly what the consumer has set as their privacy settings, but I would think that you would be able to have that information. Whereas clearly for a really effective collaborative filtering system, you'd want to know as much as possible about all of the different choices by all of the different users, or anywhere on the web, and therefore actually you'd get the best recommender system if you had the most data, and clearly then privacy policy could impact on it. But I think it's going to depend on you'd have to look at the facts of the case, basically.
Thanks.